If you are burning 5 logs a night and the room is still cold by midnight, a Hartford editor settled this for you in 1873. Charles Dudley Warner kept a fireplace nearly 3 feet wide, and in a book of fireside essays, he stopped to write one blunt line: "Few people know how to make a wood fire." Then he gave the method: 2 logs. But here is the twist, friend. The federal government measured that method 68 years later, and by then the American fireplace had been rebuilt into a box that cannot hold it. Warner published that book the same year he and his neighbor Mark Twain named an era. He was not a woodsman. He was a man who had watched something ordinary start to disappear and decided to write it down before it went. There are 7 things in that journal about the 2 log fire. Number 3 is the one that costs nothing, and that most men watching this get exactly backward tonight. Number 5 is why a federal engineer told American families to shut a damper down to 1 inch of opening. And number 7 is not a technique at all. Number 7 is the reason I bothered to sit down and talk to you. None of this faded because it quit working. It faded because somebody got rich the day you forgot it. That is not on you, friend. They are very good at selling. Tap subscribe if you want the rest of what is in that journal, because we are pulling buried knowledge back into daylight one winter at a time. Southeastern New Hampshire, 1869. A local historian writes down how the families of Old Chester built their fires, and the description is so specific it reads like a work order. First the back log, a foot to a foot and a half through, then a smaller back stick laid on top of it, then a forestick out front, resting on andirons if the household could afford andirons, and on stones if it could not, small wood in the space between them. A Vermont agricultural report from 1877, describing the 1820s, says the boy of the house hauled the back log in on a hand sled because it ran a foot and a half to 2 feet through and 4 feet long. 1 log. Hauled by sleddie, because it was not fuel for the evening. It was the wall the evening burned against. A New England account from 1845 describes the same arrangement and adds one detail that stops most modern readers cold. The back log and the forestick were both green, freshly cut, wet, heavy wood, laid deliberately into a fire, because a green log resists being consumed, and a log that resists being consumed is a log that is still there at 4 in the morning. That is the whole architecture, neighbor. A big log at the back that barely burns, a smaller log in front that burns steadily, and a narrow slot between them where the actual fire lives. Back log, forestick, gap between. Now here is what almost nobody understands about why that works, and it is not folklore, it is radiation. A single log sitting alone in a firebox cannot sustain a fire, and every woodsman in this country has watched it happen. You lay one nice split on the coals, walk away, and come back to a black, smoldering stick. The reason is that wood does not burn. The gas coming out of wood burns. To keep making that gas, the wood has to be held above roughly 500 degrees. And a lone log cannot hold itself there, because every bit of heat it throws goes somewhere that is not the log. Air, masonry, chimney. Put a second log 2 or 3 inches away facing it, and the arithmetic flips. Each log is now being heated by the other. The slot between them traps radiant heat between 2 hot faces and bounces it back and forth, and because that slot is narrow, very little of the heat escapes sideways. That gap becomes the hottest square inch in the fireplace, and it stays hot without you touching it. The 2 logs are not sharing a fire. They are running one. 6 split sticks stacked in a pile do the exact opposite of this, friend. They give you enormous surface area, a fast, bright flame, a great deal of light, and a fire that has spent its whole fuel load in 40 minutes. You are not building heat. You are building surface. The old man used to say the fire does not live in the wood. It lives in the space between the wood. But the version of this you have probably never seen is not American at all, and it is the one that proves the physics past arguing. In the northern forests of Finland and Sweden, there is a fire lake called the Rakavalkia, the gap fire. 2 large logs, one stacked directly on top of the other, held apart by wedges driven at each end, with the fire burning in the slot between them rather than underneath. Depending on the diameter of the logs and the species, that fire runs between 4 and 9 hours without being fed. Woodsmen slept beside it in Arctic winter with an open shelter at their backs. When they wanted more heat, they widened the gap. When they wanted less, they closed it. The entire control system is 2 wedges and a stick. 2-column math on that, friend. A backpacking stove at an outdoor chain today runs you $69 plus fuel canisters at $8 a piece, and it will boil you a cup of water. The rack of Valkia costs 2 logs and 4 wedges cut with the axe already in your hand, and it heats a sleeping body until sunrise. Same principle as Warner's Hearth. Same principle as Old Chester. A gap, 2 masses, and patience. Pattern break, neighbor. What comes next is the part most people undo every single time they tidy up after themselves. Do not sweep your hearth clean. An open fireplace wants an ash bed. An inch or 2 of ash under the fire does 3 jobs at once. It insulates the masonry so the floor of the firebox stops stealing heat out of your coals. It holds the coal bed together so it does not spread thin and die. And it keeps air from getting underneath your logs, which sounds like sabotage until you understand what a roaring fire actually is. A roaring fire is your heat leaving. This is also what andirons were for, not decoration. They hold the wood up off the floor and keep a round log from rolling into your living room, and that is the end of the job description. They were never a grate. A grate is coal equipment. It lifts the fuel into the air and feeds it oxygen from below, which is exactly what anthracite needs and exactly what a hardwood log does not. If you have a steel basket grate sitting in a wood fireplace tonight, neighbor, you are running coal hardware on wood fuel, and it will burn through a $350 cord like it is newspaper. That same federal bulletin, we are coming to put the overnight step in writing. Bank the fire. Rake the coals and the unburned wood into one pile and cover that pile with a few inches of ash or earth. That is the entire method for carrying fire from one night into the next morning. Farm families did it for 300 years and never bought a match. Ash bed, andirons, bank it. Now, before we get to the man who got rich, I owe you the man who got it right, because he is the reason the modern firebox looks the way it does, and he would be appalled at what was done with his name. In 1796, an Anglo-American physicist called Count Rumford published an essay on chimney fireplaces in London. Born Benjamin Thompson in Woburn, Massachusetts. He had studied heat more carefully than almost anyone alive, and he concluded that a fireplace warms a room by radiation, the way the sun warms your face across cold air, and not by heating the air itself. So he redesigned the thing on that principle. He made the firebox shallow so the fire sits out toward the room. He splayed the sidewalls wide so they act as reflectors instead of absorbers. And then he did the part that actually mattered. He straightened the back and rounded off the throat into a smooth, narrow nozzle so the smoke went up cleanly without dragging half the heated room along with it. It worked so well it became a fashion. 250 London fireplaces were rebuilt to his pattern inside 2 months. Jefferson put them in at Monticello. Rumford refused to patent any of it and published the whole thing for anybody to copy. Hold on to that, neighbor, because 150 years later, an industry kept exactly one of Rumford's 3 ideas. It kept shallow. It threw away the reflector angles and it threw away the rounded throat, because those cost mason hours and shallow cost nothing. Rumford made it shallow on purpose. They made it shallow to save money. In 1927, a company in Syracuse, New York started selling the first factory-built air-circulating fireplace. It was called the Heatilator, and on its own terms it was a fine piece of engineering. A metal firebox with air chambers wrapped around it, delivered on a truck, dropped into place, bricked around. No master mason required. No 40 years of hearth knowledge required. A builder could put a fireplace in a house in an afternoon. And that is the honest shape of this story, friend. Not villainy. Convenience. Because once the firebox arrives on a truck, the firebox has to fit on the truck. It has to fit the framing of a tract house. It has to hit a price a builder will accept without arguing. And every one of those pressures pushes in exactly one direction. Smaller. Look at what got lost. The Department of Agriculture recorded that in colonial days, when cordwood was everywhere, fireplaces 7 feet wide and 5 feet high were common, especially in kitchens where the cooking was done. By 1941, the federal recommendation for an ordinary room was 30 to 36 inches wide and 16 to 18 inches deep. A builder-grade firebox in a house put up in the last 40 years is often shallower still. Here is what a 16-inch deep box means in practice. You cannot lay a proper backlog in it. You cannot leave a 3-inch gap in front of that backlog. You cannot get a 4-stick out ahead of the gap without the forestick hanging out into the room where the sparks land on your rug. The geometry Warner described in 1873 does not physically fit anymore. Nobody banned the two-log fire. Nobody wrote a law against a backlog. The box just got too small for it, a quarter inch at a time, across 60 years, because a shallower box was cheaper to ship and faster to install. Not a conspiracy, neighbor, just how markets work. I am not your building inspector, and I am not your county fire marshal. Do not go knocking brick out of a firebox on my say-so. Know your chimney, know your clearances. The box shrank. The knowledge went with it. By December of 1941, with the country 3 weeks away from a war and every ton of coal already spoken for, the Department of Agriculture published Farmer's Bulletin 1889, Fireplaces and Chimneys, written by a mechanical engineer named Arthur Center and an agricultural engineer named Thomas Miller, out of the Bureau of Agricultural Chemistry and Engineering. 52 pages, 15 cents at the Superintendent of Documents. And inside it, the government printed 3 numbers that the hearth industry has been quietly working around ever since. First, their own test found that an ordinary fireplace pulls about 5 times the amount of air into a living room that generous ventilation actually requires. Every cubic foot of that is warm air you already paid to heat, going up the flue, replaced by cold air dragged in through every gap in your walls. The Environmental Protection Agency says the same thing in modern language. Most traditional open fireplaces lose better than 90% of the fire's heat straight out the chimney, and much of the room's warm air goes up with it. Second, those same tests found that a fireplace, as ordinarily constructed, is only about 1/3 as efficient as a good stove. Not a modern catalytic stove, a 1941 stove made of cast iron with the door on it. Third, and this is number 5 on Eli's list, the bulletin tells the householder how to actually run the damper. A roaring pine fire may want the throat wide open, but slow-burning hardwood logs, in the government's own words, may need only 1 or 2 inches of opening. An inch. That is the setting. That is the United States government on the eve of a world war, telling American families that a properly built hardwood fire needs the damper nearly shut. I would guess nobody has ever told you that. Nobody told me either, until a man with dirt under his fingernails handed me a bulletin printed before he was born. That is not folklore, neighbor. That is the federal government confirming what your great-grandmother did by feel. Damper down. Wood large, gap tight. If this is landing for you, tap subscribe. I put one of these out every week and the next one is already written. And then, 27 years later, somebody solved the problem that the small firebox had created. They solved it by selling you the fire itself. In 1968, the California Cedar Products Company in Stockton, California had a waste problem. They cut wood slats for the pencil industry, and the operation threw off sawdust faster than anyone could haul it away. So they mixed the sawdust with petroleum wax, built an extruder to press the mixture, and shaped it into a log. In 1971, the subsidiary got a name of its own, Duraflame. Now read the design specification because that is where the story is. The product they engineered was a log that would burn steadily for 3 hours. That was the target the engineers were given. Not overnight, not until dawn, but 3 hours. In a wrapper, lit with a single match, no ash bed, no andirons, no backlog, no skill. It was a perfect product for the firebox that had just been installed in millions of American living rooms. Too shallow for a backlog, too shallow for a gap, but exactly the right size for a wax brick that burns itself out before bedtime. By the middle of the 1970s, that company held about half the market. Today, the manufactured fire log category runs somewhere around $250 million a year in retail sales in this country, and the Environmental Protection Agency counts roughly 13 million fireplaces in American homes for it to sell into. 2-column friend, and this one leaves a mark. A full cord of split-season hardwood delivered runs from $275 to $400 across most of the country in 2026. A cord is 128 cubic feet of wood, burned as 2 log fires. On an ash bed, banked overnight, a cord carries a room through most of a heating season. Or you can buy the wax. Roughly $4 a log, 3 hours a log, 1 log a night from November through March. Run that arithmetic honestly, and the wrapper costs you more than the wood lot. The fire log is not a swindle. It does exactly what the box says it does, and it lights with a match in a fireplace too small for anything else. Some nights that is the right call. Not a conspiracy, friend, just how markets work. The wax burns for 3 hours. The oak burns until you wake up. Now, the part where I stop being encouraging, because this is where people get hurt. Everything I have described only works with dry wood, and a great many people are burning wet wood without knowing they are doing it. That same 1941 bulletin lays the chemistry out plainly. Green wood may run as high as 40% water. Properly dried wood sits at 15 to 20%. When wood burns slowly, it gives off acetic and pyroligneous acid, and those acids combine with the moisture in the smoke and condense as creosote on any cool flue wall they touch. The modern federal target is under 20% moisture, with 6 months of seasoning for softwood and a full year for hardwood. Oak in particular wants 18 months or better before you put it near a match. Here is the failure mode that follows, friend, and I want you to hear it clearly. A long, slow, damp down overnight fire is exactly the condition that manufactures creosote. Run that fire on wet wood in a cold outside chimney with the damper nearly closed, and you are laying tar on your flue walls all night long while you sleep. That is not a small thing. The National Fire Protection Association found that across 2006 to 2010, the single leading factor in home heating fires, at 26%, was failure to clean, principally creosote from solid fuel equipment. In 2010 alone, American fire departments answered 57,100 home structure fires involving heating equipment. 490 people died. Property damage came to $1.1 billion. The correction is neither complicated nor expensive. A pen-type moisture meter costs about $20 at any hardware counter. Split a piece, test the fresh inside face, and burn nothing over 20%. Get the flue swept before the season starts. I am not your fire inspector, but I will say plainly that the old method and a dirty chimney do not belong in the same house. Dry wood, clean flue, then the long burn. I ruined a night once, and Eli did not say a word about it until morning. I was 14. He had gone down the mountain and left me to lay the fire, and I wanted him to come back and see that I could do it right. So I split everything small. I mean everything. Beautiful uniform sticks stacked up like a hayrick, kindling laid underneath, damper wide open. It caught like a torch. The flames went 2 feet up the throat, and the whole room glowed orange, and I sat there proud of myself. By 10 o'clock, the wood was gone, and the room was colder than when I started, because I had spent 4 hours pumping heated air out of that house and pulling January in through the door frame to replace it. He came in at first light, looked at the dead gray hearth, and did not raise his voice. He never once raised his voice at me over a mistake, neighbor, and I have thought about that more than I have thought about the fire. He knelt down, raked what was left into one pile, laid a wet green oak round at the back of it, and told me the only thing he ever said about it. A big fire warms the room. A small fire warms the house. Then he said the other thing he always said. Now you know. So here is the build, plain, in the order you do it. 1. Leave the ash. 1 inch or 2 on the floor of the firebox, level, no grate. If you are starting from a swept hearth, burn 1 ordinary fire first and keep whatever it leaves you. 2. Set the backlog. The biggest round you own, unsplit if you can get it, laid at the very back against the fire back and sitting directly on the ash bed, not on the andirons. This log is not there to burn well. It is there to store heat and throw it forward, and it will still be there in the morning. 3. Set the forestick. A smaller split log on the andirons out front, parallel to the back log, with a gap of 2 to 3 inches between the two. That gap is the whole invention. Too tight and it smothers itself. Too wide and the two faces stop heating each other. 3 inches is what Eli marked in the journal, and 3 inches is what I use. 4. Build the fire in the gap and build it from the top down. Kindling and paper go above the split wood, not underneath it. The fire burns down into the fuel instead of racing up through it, which gives you a hot flue in the first 10 minutes and a fraction of the smoke. 5. Once the gap is established and the flue is drawing hot, bring the damper down. Slow hardwood wants 1 inch or 2 a throat, no more. Watch the smoke line at the top of the opening. If it rolls back into the room, open up 1 inch and leave it alone. 6. Bank it before bed. Rake the coals and the unburned ends into one pile hard against that backlog and cover the pile with ash. In the morning, scrape it open, lay kindling on the live coals, and your fire comes back without a match. That is the whole method, friend. 6 steps. and it costs you nothing you do not already own. But number 7 is not a step, and it never was. Number 7 is this. Every single item on that list is a decision you make with your own hands, on your own schedule, using material that fell on your own ground or came off a truck once a season. Not one step requires a subscription. Not one step charges you by the night. Not one step asks you to be strong or young or trained. Warner was not writing an instruction manual in 1873. He was writing an obituary in advance. He could already see that knowing how to hold a fire overnight was turning into the sort of thing a man had to be formally taught, and that fewer people were teaching it every year. He was right. It took about a century. The two-log fire is the difference between a man who owns his own hearth and a man who rents his warmth by the wrapper. That is all sovereignty has ever meant on this channel. Not a bunker, not a stockpile, just a short list of things nobody can price you out of. The wood was never the expensive part. The knowing was. Here is what I want you to do this week. Not next winter. This week. Go out to your pile and find the ugliest, heaviest, most knotted round you own, the one you have been walking past all year because it will not split. That is your backlog. Set it at the back of the firebox on the ash. Put a normal split log in front of it 3 inches out. Light the gap from the top and bring the damper down once it draws. Then go to bed and look at it in the morning. That is all. One round, one gap, one night. Then tell me down below, friend, did your grandmother or your granddaddy have a fire rule in that house? A thing they said about the backlog or about the ash or about what you were never allowed to do to the hearth? I read every one of them, and I build the next video off whichever gets the most comments. So if your family knew something, say it out loud where somebody else's grandchildren can find it. Next time we are going after a piece of hearth equipment your great-grandmother had bolted into her chimney, which the manufacturers replaced in the 1950s, with a product that does half the job for 6 times the money. It sat in nearly every farmhouse in this country. It cost about $1. And I have not been able to buy a new one anywhere in 20 years. That fireplace in Hartford is long cold, and the man who sat in front of it has been in Cedar Hill Cemetery since 1900. But the 3 inches he left between his 2 logs are still 3 inches. The physics did not die. The firebox just got smaller. Keep the old ways. They kept us.